Discontinuous measurement momentary time sampling. Let's review the procedures required for an RBT to collect data using momentary time sampling. First, we're going to take a look at the performance monitoring tool. This is the tool we use to make sure RBTs are collecting momentary time sampling data correctly. These are the steps they have to complete when taking data. This is where we, the supervisors, take the data to make sure they're performing the steps correctly, and this is where we report their overall percentage of steps performed correctly. Now let's look at a momentary time sampling datasheet used by the RBT. Here on the datasheet is where the RBT writes their own initials, the client name, the date, the observation time, the length of the intervals, and the target behavior. And here is where the actual data collection takes place within each interval. As you watch this next video, once again, keep in mind that you're going to be watching the RBT on the left, taking data on the client. Intervals will be 10 seconds, and the target behavior for this video will be attending, which is defined as any instance of the client facing forward and looking in the direction of the chalkboard. So let's use the performance monitoring tool to see how Lance, our RBT, does using momentary time sampling. The first step, did the RBT gather all necessary materials before beginning the session? We can see that Lance has his pen, his datasheet, and his interval timer on his smartphone ready to go. So for this step, he gets a plus. Next, we will say that Lance did review the target behaviors and operational definitions that were provided to him prior to getting ready for data collection. So for this step, let's go ahead and give him a plus. Next, we will look at the prepared data sheet. First, we want to look at, did the RBT write the initials, client name, and date at the top of the data sheet? Here we can see that Lance wrote his initials and the client's as well as the date. So for this step, he gets a plus. Next, did the RBT record the target behavior to be observed? We can see here that the target behavior to be observed is attending. So for this step, he gets a plus. Did the RBT record the length of time for each interval based on the client's program? Here we can see on the datasheet that Lance has filled out the length of intervals, which are 10 seconds. So for this step, he gets a plus. Finally, did he record the start time of the time sample? So here at the observation start time, we see that Lance wrote down 10 o'clock a.m. So for this step, he gets a plus. Great work. Next, we'll move to watching him take his data. As we watch Lance, the RBT, collect data using momentary time sampling, keep a few things in mind. We're looking at the client to see if at the end of each 10-second interval, that is, when the timer goes off, is she engaging in the target behavior, which is attending, which we defined as sitting facing forward in her chair and looking at the chalkboard. If she is attending at the end of the interval, Lance will give her a plus. If she's not attending at the end of the interval, Lance will give her a minus. So let's watch the first interval and see what happens.
Okay, so today we are doing addition. We have 1 plus 1 equals 2.
All right, nice work. At the end of the interval, our client is not attending because she is not looking up towards the board. So she got a minus on interval 1. So going over to our PMT, we're going to say that Lance, our RBT, gets credit for correctly marking that the behavior did not occur within the interval. So here, he gets a plus. Let's watch the next interval.
On the next line, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And do 3 plus 3.
Nice. So at the end of the second interval, the client was sitting facing forward and looking at the chalkboard. So Lance gave her a plus, which was correct. So over in our PMT, for the step that says if the target behavior occurred when the interval ended, mark a plus, we're going to give Lance a plus. Great work. Let's watch the next interval.
3 plus 3, that is 6. 4 plus 4.
Awesome. Once again, we see that the client is sitting up and is facing the chalkboard at the end of the 10-second interval. So once again, Lance gave her a plus, which is correct. So on our PMT, we're going to give him a plus. Let's keep going.
8. Now next is 5 plus 5.
All right, so at the end of that interval, she's clearly looking down and not attending to the chalkboard. So she got a minus for the fourth interval. So over here on our PMT, again, we're going to give Lance a plus for correctly marking that. Now let's look at interval 5.
Nobody. That's 10. Equals 6.
Okay, good job. Once again, at the end of the interval when the timer goes off, the client is not attending. So she gets a minus on her data sheet, and we're going to give Lance a plus for correctly taking that data.
12.
All right, excellent. The last interval that we observed, she was not attending to the board. She was looking in the opposite direction. So Lance gave her a minus, which was the correct data to take. So over here in our PMT, we're going to give Lance one more plus for data collection. Awesome work. All right, to finish up our PMT, we need to look at the completed data sheet. So the next step we're going to look at in the PMT is at the end of the time sample, did the RBT record the end time? So here we see that at observation end time, Lance marked that he finished his observation at 10:01 a.m. for a total observation of 1 minute, which does correspond to the 6 10-second intervals that he took data for. So for this step, we give Lance a plus. The last step is, did the RBT calculate the percent of intervals with the occurrence of the target behavior correctly? So here we see that there were 2 total intervals in which the client engaged in attending, which was the target behavior. So 2 intervals out of the 6 where data was recorded comes out to 33% of intervals with occurrence of the target behavior. Lance did in fact calculate this correctly and put the correct percentage on the data sheet. So for the final step of our PMT, we're going to give Lance a plus. Now, to report on the total percentage of correct steps, we look at all of the steps of the PMT and see that he performed every step correctly. Therefore, Lance has earned 100%. Great work. Okay, so for the second video, we're going to move a little more quickly. Once again, we're using the performance monitoring tool to see how Lance our RBT does doing momentary time sampling. Step number 1 is for the RBT to gather all necessary materials before beginning the session. Here we see that Lance has his pen, his data sheet, and the interval timer on his phone to get ready to go. So he gets a plus. Step 2, did he review the target behaviors and operational definitions? Again, we will say that he did indeed review the target behavior and definitions before he started his data collection. So for this step, we'll give him a plus. Now let's look at the prepared data sheet. The first step is to write RBT initials, client name, and date at the top of the sheet. He wrote his initials, but he did not write the client's initials or the date on the top of the data sheet. So for this step, Lance is going to get a minus. Recorded the target behavior to be observed. Again, it looks like Lance, our RBT, forgot to indicate the target behavior on his data sheet. So for this step as well, he gets a minus. Record the length of time for each interval based on the client's program. Here we see that Lance did include the interval length, which is 10 seconds for each interval. So for this step, he'll get a plus. Finally, did he record the start time of the time sample? Here, on observation start time, we see the cell is blank, meaning Lance forgot to enter this, so he's going to get a minus for this step of the PMT. Next, we'll watch Lance collect his data and see how he does. As we continue watching the video to see how Lance collects data using momentary time sampling, remember that we're looking to see whether our client is attending, meaning she's sitting facing forward and looking at the chalkboard at the end of each 10-second interval. If she is attending when the timer goes off, she should get a plus. If she is not attending when the timer goes off, she should get a minus. So let's watch the first interval to see how Lance, our RBT, does with data collection.
4, 8. Now next misses. 5 plus 5.
All right, nice work. When the timer went off at the end of the interval, our client was not attending because she was not facing the chalkboard. So Lance correctly marked a minus, meaning the non-occurrence of the target behavior. So over on our PMT, we're going to give him a plus for accurately taking data. Let's go ahead and look at the next interval.
Nobody. That's 10. Plus 6.
Great job once again. When the timer went off at the end of the interval, we see that the client is not attending. So Lance gave her a minus at the end of the interval, which is correct. So let's go back to our PMT and give Lance credit for correctly taking data on the non-occurrence of the target behavior. Let's keep going.
12. 7 plus 7.
Perfect. Once again, the client is not attending when the timer goes off, so she gets a minus. So we're going to go back to our PMT and give Lance another plus. He's doing great.
Anybody. 700.
Nice work. At the end of that interval, when the timer went off, the client was facing forward and looking at the chalkboard, meaning she was attending, so she got a plus on the data sheet. Really good. We're going to go back to our PMT and give Lance a plus for correctly marking the occurrence of the behavior. Good job.
14.
All right, very nice. At the end of that interval, when the timer went off, the client was not attending, and so she got a minus on the data sheet. So on our PMT, once again, we're going to give Lance a plus for correctly taking data. We have one more interval to watch.
8 plus 8. 6.
All right, really well done. At the end of the final interval, we see that our client is facing forward and looking in the direction of the chalkboard. So she got a plus for the final interval. So back to the PMT, once again, we give Lance a plus because he accurately marked the occurrence of the behavior within that interval. So to finish the performance monitoring tool, let's look at the last two steps. First, at the end of the time sample, we want to know if the RBT recorded the end time. Here on the data sheet, we see that Lance did not record the observation end time. So for this step, he's going to get a minus. The last step is, did the RBT calculate the percent of intervals with the occurrence of the target behavior correctly? Here we see that Lance took data for 6 10-second intervals, and for 2 of those intervals, the client was engaging in the target behavior by attending. So 2 out of 6 comes out to 33%. So Lance did correctly calculate the percentage of intervals with the occurrence of the target behavior and indicated it on the data sheet. So for this step, we're going to give him a plus. Now it's time to look at the total percentage of steps performed correctly. Even though Lance did a great job with data collection and accurately recorded the occurrence or non-occurrence of the target behavior during all of the intervals, we can't give him 100% because he got 1, 2, 3, 4 minuses. He didn't completely fill out his data sheet, which is important because we need to know who the client is, when the data was collected, the times of the data collection, and the target behavior in order to accurately reflect client progress. So in missing these steps, he has 10 out of 14 total steps performed correctly, meaning he gets a total of 71% correct.